Imagine for a moment that you are a German locomotive fireman in the winter of 1943. You are exhausted. Your hands are calloused and your lungs are heavy with the thick black dust of the industrial age. Behind you, a heavy train pulls miles of ammunition and medical crates toward a front line that is slowly collapsing. Your job is simple, but vital. You must feed the fire. Every shovel of coal you heave into the roaring white heat of the firebox is another few yards of momentum for the Third Reich. But as you plunge your shovel into the tender, you have no way of knowing that one of these black, jagged stones is a lie. Looks like coal. It feels like coal. It even weighs the same as coal. But in a few seconds, when you toss it into the flames, it will not burn. It will detonate with enough force to shred a steel boiler as if it were made of wet cardboard. This was the terrifying reality of the coal scuttle, a weapon so deceptively simple that it crippled the most advanced logistics network in the world. It raises a haunting question that every historian must eventually grapple with. How does a global superpower, armed with Tiger tanks and jet engines, lose a war to a piece of painted plaster? To understand the genius of this weapon, we have to look past the battlefields of North Africa or the ruins of Stalingrad, and look instead at the veins and arteries of the German war machine. They die. In my 1942, Nazi Germany had transformed Europe into a massive, interconnected factory, but that factory had a fatal flaw. It was entirely dependent on steam. While we often think of World War II as a war of internal combustion and oil, the reality on the ground was far more Victorian. The German military moved on rails. Every tank that reached the front, every loaf of bread that fed a soldier, and every shell fired from a heavy gun had to be moved by a coal-fired locomotive. Germany controlled over 300,000 kilometers of track, a network so vast that it was physically impossible to guard every inch. From a strategic perspective, this was a masterstroke of occupation. But it created a target-rich environment for anyone brave enough to strike at the supply lines. The British Special Operations Executive, or the SOE, understood this vulnerability better than anyone. They realized that if they could poison the fuel of the Reich, it could cause a systemic heart attack without ever firing a traditional shot. This brings us to the shadowy workshops of Baker Street in London, specifically a place known as Station 15 in the history books. We celebrate the generals, but we rarely talk about the men of the toy shop, the chemists and engineers who were tasked with the impossible. One of these men was Stuart McCrae, a man whose mind worked like a criminal mastermind in the service of the crown. McCrae's philosophy was built on a single, brilliant observation. The best place to hide a weapon is inside the very thing the enemy is searching for. If the Germans were looking for bombs, McCrae would give them something that looked like junk. He had already experimented with explosive rats and booby-trapped fruit, but the locomotive problem required something more industrial. He knew that if a train's boiler exploded while in motion, it wasn't just a loss of equipment. It was a catastrophic failure that could block a main line for days, derail dozens of cars, and kill the highly trained crew. But he also knew that a traditional bomb attached to the outside of a train was too easy to find. The solution had to be internal. The development of the explosive coal was a feat of artistry as much as engineering. McCrae and his team didn't just make a black box. They became geologists of the fake. They collected samples of coal from every region the Germans occupied. They studied the dull, brownish hue of German lignite and the glass-like shimmer of French anthracite. They understood that a railway worker in Belgium would notice if his coal suddenly looked like it came from a mine in Wales. Analysis of this decision reveals a level of psychological depth that is often missing from modern military planning. The British weren't just building a bomb. They were building a Trojan horse that had to survive the scrutiny of 1,000 eyes. They created plaster molds from real lumps of coal, ensuring that every crack and surface texture was authentic. Inside these shells, they packed Nobel 808, a plastic explosive that was remarkably stable. It wouldn't go off if the train hit a bump or if the coal was dropped. It required the specific, intense heat of a firebox roughly 160 degrees Celsius to trigger the chemical reaction. This meant the weapon was its own timer. The moment of destruction was dictated by the very act of using the fuel. When we look at the deployment of these coal scuttles, we see the true power of the European resistance movements. The SOE began parachuting small crates of this explosive coal to agents in France, Denmark, and Poland. However, The instructions were specific. Do not be a hero. A lone saboteur trying to sneak onto a guarded locomotive was likely to be caught and executed. Instead, the resistance fighters were told to engage in what we might call logistical pollution. They would sneak into massive coal depots or rail yards at night and simply scatter 20 or 30 lumps of the fake coal into a pile of 10,000 real ones. It was like dropping a few drops of poison into a city's reservoir. From that moment on, every train that fueled up at that depot was carrying a potential death sentence. This was a brilliant move because it removed the human element from the immediate sabotage. There was no one for the Gestapo to catch at the scene of the explosion because the crime had been committed weeks earlier and miles away. The first reports of success were often dismissed by the German High Command as mechanical failure or poor maintenance. When a boiler explodes, it tends to destroy the evidence of what caused the surge in pressure. Metal is twisted, the coal is scattered, and the water is vaporized. For the first few MONTHS of 1942, German engineers simply thought the quality of their steel was declining or that their crews were being negligent. This is a classic example of how a well-designed weapon exploits the ego of the enemy. The Germans prided themselves on their engineering, so they looked for engineering solutions to what was actually a tactical problem. They wasted months trying to reinforce boiler plates when they should have been guarding their coal piles with machine guns. This delay in recognition was exactly what the SOE needed to scale up the operation. By the time the Germans realized they were being sabotaged, the poison had already spread across the entire European rail network. As an historian, I find the German reaction to this threat to be one of the most fascinating hidden stories of the war. Once they discovered a few unexploded samples, the German railway authorities went into a state of total panic. They issued orders that every lump of coal for military transport had to be inspected. Think about the sheer absurdity of that command. Single locomotive requires tons of fuel for a long journey. Asking a crew to visually inspect 10,000 black rocks in a dark rail yard is like asking someone to find a specific grain of sand on a beach. This decision looked logical on paper. Security must be absolute. But in reality, it was a self-inflicted wound. The inspections slowed down the trains. The delays caused supply bottlenecks. The bottlenecks meant that soldiers on the Eastern Front didn't get their winter coats until the spring. This is the ripple effect of sabotage. The bomb doesn't just destroy a train, it destroys the efficiency of the entire system. By 1943, the psychological impact began to outweigh the physical damage. This is a section of history that books rarely explain in detail. The paranoia of the shovel. Imagine the mental state of a German train crew. They knew that at any moment the very material they were handling could kill them. Every time they opened the firebox door and felt that blast of heat, they were stepping into the path of a potential explosion. There are documented accounts of firemen refusing to work, or crews demanding that all coal be dumped and replaced with verified German coal. But there was no such thing as verified coal in a war zone. The fear created a phantom enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. In military theory, we call this a force multiplier. The British only had to manufacture a few thousand lumps of coal to make the Germans doubt the safety of millions of tons of fuel. The cost-to-benefit ratio was staggering. For the price of some plaster and a few pounds of explosive, the Allies were neutralizing the effectiveness of the most expensive locomotives in the world. Let us look closer at the unique section of this history, a part of the narrative that is almost never discussed in standard documentaries. The failure of the German counter-sabotage science. The Germans weren't stupid. They tried to use their own scientific brilliance to fight back. They developed chemical tests to see if coal had been tampered with. They even tried to use X-ray machines at major hubs to scan coal tenders. But the sheer volume of the logistics overwhelmed their ability to be thorough. This reveals a profound truth about World War II. The German obsession with perfection was often their undoing. They tried to build a perfect defense against a weapon that thrived on chaos. The British, on the other hand, embraced the dirty nature of the war. They didn't care if half of the fake coal never went off. They only cared that the Germans thought it might. This was psychological warfare in its purest form, targeting the confidence of the working-class men who kept the Reich moving. There is a specific incident in Denmark that perfectly illustrates the strategic value of this weapon. A Danish resistance cell had managed to acquire a shipment of explosive coal, but they were being closely watched by the SS. Instead of trying to hit the big troop transports, they targeted the small shunting engines in the Copenhagen yards. These were the workhorses that moved cars around to form larger trains. Within 2 weeks, 4 of these engines had their boilers blown out. The Germans were forced to bring in armored locomotives from Germany to handle even the simplest yard work. This diversion of specialized equipment away from the front lines was a massive win for the Allies. It's a reminder that in war, small targets can have large consequences. By taking out the local shunting engines, the resistance paralyzed the entire hub, proving that you don't need to sink a battleship to win a campaign. Sometimes you just need to break the forklift that loads the battleship. Historians still debate the exact number of trains destroyed by the coal scuttle. While some SOE records suggest over 1,000, the truth is likely buried in the chaos of the war's end. Many explosions were probably never recorded as sabotage because the crews didn't survive to tell the tale. Or the investigators were too busy dealing with Allied bombing raids to care about a single locomotive. But the numbers almost don't matter. What matters is the shift in the logistical consciousness of the German army. By the time of the D-Day landings in 1944, the French rail system was a wreck. Between the aerial bombing by the RAF and the silent cold-born sabotage of the resistance, the Germans found it nearly impossible to move reinforcements to the Normandy coast. This single mistake, the failure to secure the coal supply, changed the timing of the entire liberation of Europe. If the German panzers could have moved by rail at full speed, the history of the 20th century might look very different. We must also analyze the ethical dimension of this weapon. Unlike a bomb dropped from a plane, which often killed civilians in the surrounding area, the explosive coal was a precision instrument. It targeted the machine and the people operating the military infrastructure. It was a clean way to fight a dirty war, at least from the perspective of the SOE. It allowed the resistance to strike back without inviting the massive retaliatory executions that often followed a more public assassination or bombing. Because the Germans couldn't prove it was sabotage for a long time, they couldn't justify burning down a village in revenge. This made the coal scuttle the ultimate weapon for an occupied people. It provided a way to resist that was invisible, effective, and relatively safe for the surrounding population. It was the weapon of the ghost. Now, let us consider a perspective that history books rarely touch upon: the economic exhaustion caused by the fake coal. Every time a locomotive was destroyed, it represented thousands of man-hours of labor and tons of precious steel. Germany was already facing a massive labor shortage, relying on forced labor to keep its factories running. The destruction of 1,000 locomotives wasn't just a military loss. It was a massive drain on the industrial capacity of the Reich. They were forced to build Kriegslokomotiven, or war locomotives, simplified, stripped-down versions of their engines just to keep up with the losses. These engines were less efficient and more prone to breaking down, which only made the coal paranoia worse. The fake coal acted as a catalyst that sped up the natural decay of the German industrial base. It was a slow-acting poison that ensured that by 1945, the German transport system was essentially dead on its feet. Why does this story still matter today? In an era of cyber warfare and drone strikes, the story of the fake coal reminds us that the most effective weapons are often the ones that target the assumptions of the enemy. The Germans assumed that coal was coal. They assumed that their logistics were a strength, not a weakness. They assumed that a small group of inventors in London couldn't possibly affect the movement of an entire army. Every time we rely on a complex system today, whether it's the internet, the power grid, or global shipping, we are making the same assumptions. The coal scuttle is a warning that the more we depend on a lifeblood fuel or system, the more vulnerable we become to the fake entry. It is a lesson in humility for any technological superpower. If we look at the final months of the war, we see a German railway system that had essentially reverted to the Middle Ages. With no reliable coal and a constant fear of sabotage, they were forced to move supplies by horse and cart. The modern army had been stripped of its speed. This was the ultimate victory of Stuart McCrae and the SOE. They didn't just blow up some trains. They dragged the German military back in time. They neutralized the advantage of industrialization. As a historian, I see this as one of the most elegant strategic accomplishments in human history. It required no massive budget, no Manhattan Project, and no thousands of lives lost in a frontal assault. It required only a few clever minds, some black paint, and the courage of ordinary railway workers who were tired of living under a boot. The human element of this story is what stays with me. We often talk about the war of the scientists, but this was a war of the artists. The men at Station 15 had to be master painters and sculptors. They had to understand the soul of a lump of coal. If they had failed their art class, the Sabotage would have failed. This intersection of art and war is a rare thing to find in history. It shows that creativity is just as important as firepower. The resistance fighters, too, were artists of a different kind. Artists of the disappearing act. They had to blend into the scenery of the rail yard, becoming as invisible as the coal they were planting. This level of dedication to a silent victory is what truly won the war. These people didn't want medals. They wanted their countries back, and they were willing to use any tool, no matter how humble, to achieve it. In reflecting on the consequences, we must acknowledge that the coal scuttle was a cruel weapon in its own right. It didn't offer the enemy a chance to surrender. It was a sudden, violent end in the dark of night. But in the context of the struggle against the Nazi regime, it was a necessary cruelty. It was a response to a total war that had already abandoned all rules of engagement. The British and the resistance were fighting for survival, and in that struggle, a lump of coal became a symbol of defiance. It was a way for the small person to take down the giant machine. Every time a boiler blew, it was a message to the occupiers. You are not safe, even in your own machines. You cannot trust the ground you walk on, and you cannot trust the fire that moves you. As we conclude this editorial analysis, let us think about that German fireman one last time. He represents the tragedy of the cog in the machine. He was a man caught up in a system of evil, doing a mundane job that supported a horrific cause. His death by a fake lump of coal is a microcosm of the entire war, a collision between industrial might and ingenious subversion. The story of the fake coal that destroyed 1,000 trains is not just a footnote in a textbook. It is a testament to the power of the human imagination. It proves that in the face of overwhelming force, the most effective weapon is not a bigger gun, but a better idea. The coal scuttle didn't just break the steel of the Reich, it broke the logic of the occupation, turned the very fuel of the enemy against them, proving that even the most powerful empire can be brought down by something as small, as common, and as unassuming as a single black stone. This story matters today because it challenges our modern obsession with high-tech solutions. We spend billions on stealth bombers and satellite tracking, but the lesson of 1943 is that a low-tech disguise can be just as effective. The invisible weapon of the future might not be a computer virus. It might be something we hold in our hands every day, something so ordinary that we never think to question it. History is full of these moments where the simple triumphs over the complex. The coal scuttle remains one of the greatest examples of this truth. It was a masterpiece of deception that helped save the world from a dark age, and it did so one shovel at a time. It reminds us that while the big battles get the headlines, it is often the quiet, clever, and small actions that truly turn the tide of history. The ghost in the boiler was real, and it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, human ingenuity can find a way to strike a light, even if that light is a devastating explosion in the heart of the enemy. When we look back at the legacy of Stuart McCrae and his team, we see a group of people who changed the world by looking at it differently. They didn't see a lump of coal. They saw a container. They didn't see a locomotive. They saw a pressure vessel. They didn't see a guarded rail yard. They saw a system of trust that could be exploited. This reframing of reality is the hallmark of great strategic thinking. It is what separates a mere soldier from a true historian and strategist. As we close this chapter on the most ingenious sabotage weapon of World War II, we are left with a powerful closing thought. The greatest strength of any army is not its weapons, but its belief in its own invulnerability. Once that belief is shattered, whether by a massive invasion or a single piece of fake Cold War is already lost. The coal scuttle was more than a bomb. It was a reality check for a regime that thought it could control the world. It showed them that they couldn't even control the fire in their own stoves. And in that simple, humble failure, the seeds of their ultimate defeat were sown. The fake coal remains a silent witness to the fact that in the theater of war, appearances are everything, and the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming. The story of the coal scuttle is a reminder that the most profound changes in history often come from the most unexpected places. It wasn't just about the 1,000 trains. It was about the millions of tons of coal that were never delivered. The thousands of soldiers who never reached the front, and the collapse of a dream of empire that was built on a foundation of stolen fuel and broken rails. It is a story of how a small group of irregular warriors used the very tools of the Industrial Revolution to dismantle an industrial-scale evil. It is ultimately a story of hope, the hope that even when faced with a monolithic power, the human spirit will always find a way to innovate, to resist, and to win. The coal may have been fake, but the victory it helped achieve was very, very real. As we look at the quiet black rocks that still sit in museum displays today, we should remember that they once held the power to stop a world-conquering army in its tracks. They are a testament to a time when art, science, courage converged to create a weapon that was as invisible as it was invincible. The final analysis of this campaign shows that the SOE, dirty warfare, was perhaps the most sophisticated form of combat in the entire conflict. It didn't rely on the brute force of an atom bomb or the sheer numbers of an infantry division. It relied on the internal logic of the enemy. By understanding the German need for coal, the British turned the enemy's own needs into their greatest weakness. This is the definition of a strategic inversion. It is the ultimate goal of any historian to understand these hidden layers of cause and effect. The coal scuttle wasn't just a gadget, it was a philosophy. It was the philosophy that even the most powerful machine can be destroyed from within if you know which lump of coal to poison. This lesson, more than any other, is what we must carry forward from the history of World War II. It is a lesson about the fragility of systems, the power of deception, and the enduring strength of those who refuse to be conquered. Even if their only weapon is a piece of painted plaster and a dream of freedom, the story of the fake coal is a story of the triumph of the mind over the machine. And that is a story that will always be worth telling.